In Section 6, we're going to move on from the FCL model and now look at the ocean import operating model less than container load. We talked about the operational aspects of LCL in Module 6. We're just going to elaborate on it a bit now as an import operating model. Less than container load moves accommodate shipments that aren't large enough for a single vendor to fill a container. That's a point we made clearly in Module 6. The major advantage is that LCL freight charges are based on the amount of space or weight taken up in a container by a shipment. We also saw that in our weight or measure analysis in Module 6. One of the advantages of LCL is that it can be used with vendors that don't produce in large quantities on behalf of a U.S. importer. The POs that the U.S. importer places on a vendor aren't big enough to create a production run that fills a 40-foot container, for example. We mentioned when we were analyzing FCL that we would see this type of slide a number of times. This is a second example of that structure, this time for LCL. It should be becoming a little bit more familiar now. On the left-hand side, there's our S for supplier. The supplier producing in quantities that won't fill a container. They're going to ship those goods to an origin CFS, something we should also be very familiar with, a container freight station. The CFS operator, the ocean freight forwarder, basically is going to consolidate cargo from multiple shippers going to multiple consignees, BCOs in the United States, from the same origin port to the same port of destination in the same time frame. Those goods are then drayed to the origin port, and off goes the container or containers to a port of discharge or inland port of arrival. A quick point to make here. LCL boxes, groupage boxes as we've called them, don't have to terminate at an ocean port. They can be moved, albeit in bond, from an arrival port like a Norfolk, Virginia, and be moved in bond all the way to Chicago, where the container is stripped in a bonded facility and individual shipments are cleared through customs by individual BCOs. That's a quick but important point to make. Moving back over to the left, let's go over our supplier responsibilities, reiterating once again that a lot of these responsibilities and the charges that go with them are going to be divided between the seller and the buyer based on the chosen Incoterms rule. With that said, what are some of these supplier responsibilities? Booking with the forwarder, of course, we saw that under FCL. The commercial docs preparation, commercial invoice, packing list. Inland freight to the CFS from wherever the supplier is to that origin CFS, and export customs clearance. Very common, almost identical to FCL. Some of the charges to consider. The CFS charges on a CBM basis, receiving into a CFS, charges like that. Terminal handling charge, again on a CBM, but on a prorated basis, as we discussed in Module 6. Issuance of a forwarder's cargo receipt, that's part and parcel of LCL moves. We talked a lot about that, actually. Every shipper in an LCL box is going to need their own bill of lading. There is a fee for preparing the BL. Of course, the charge for the inland freight to the CFS, the supplier is going to organize that, but somebody has to pay that charge depending on the Incoterms rule. The goods also have to be moved from the CFS to the port of export. Needless to say, the main mode of transport, charged on a per CBM basis. There's a charge for export customs clearance, typically on the supplier, and then any destination charges. As we said in Module 6, and we bring it up here again as a pricing note, many of the above charges are baked into the per CBM price. Many of them, but not all of them. A couple of quick observations before moving on. We've said this a bunch of times. LCL is used when vendors have limited volumes of cargo. They just can't fill a container themselves. These boxes, these groupage containers, have multiple shippers in them. It's not just the freight of one supplier. As such, each vendor, each supplier, is issued its own house ocean bill of lading, And every BCO that has freight in a groupage box has to do their own individual U.S. Customs entry. LCL containers are not cleared all at once under a single importer of record. Here's a good point to make. LCL can also be used with vendors that are not in close proximity to other suppliers used by the U.S. importer. We talked about geographic clusters. We'll see it again in an upcoming section on buyer's consolidation, but a geographic cluster of vendors allows for consolidation under that buyer's consol model. This is just one way of saying that a U.S. importer buys in a country or a region where there's lots of suppliers around each other, and goods can be consolidated together. There are also situations where an importer might buy from one vendor alone in Santiago and the Central Highlands of the Dominican Republic. The POs placed on that vendor in the DR aren't big enough to fill containers. This is a good example of where LCL can come into play. If that same importer had 10 vendors in the city of Santiago in the Dominican Republic, that would be a different story, perhaps a candidate for buyer's consolidation. We'll get to that in an upcoming section. Second bullet, it is not unusual to see LCL used as a supplement to an FCL program. It is actually quite common. In one instance, first sub-bullet, a U.S. importer might have occasional small orders from FCL vendors, suppliers that they buy in large quantities from and use FCL freight. But maybe an importer is trying a new product or shifting production from one vendor to the next and taking it a little bit at a time. Another could be, and this is really common, used for overflow when a vendor ships in excess of FCL but not enough for a second container load. A PO might constitute 55 cubic meters or even more, and there's just too much freight to fit into a container. Well, whatever's left over, 2, 3, 4, 5 cubic meters, if decided, the importer can put those cubic meters in an LCL shipment. Let's illustrate that point with a supply chain perspective entitled, aptly, LCL for overflow cargo. A particularly challenging aspect of shipping via ocean freight is matching quantities of cargo with the exact size and number of ocean containers needed to ship the goods. Basically, on a per shipment basis, overseas vendors are constantly trying to figure out their equipment needs, which is to say, what size containers do they need and how many of them are required. While the above can be facilitated through access to item master file details like item-specific carton dimensions, weight, and master pack quantities, determining container needs remains an imperfect science. We're talking about cubing out a container here, basically. In the case where a vendor has too much cargo for a specific container size, a 40-foot standard as an example, it is a common practice to fill the container to its capacity and then use LCL cargo for the remaining portion of the shipment. While a viable solution, both the supplier and importer need to understand that the documentation for the FCL move must match the contents of the container and that the docs for the LCL shipment must match whatever is being shipped. The docs have to match in both instances. The commercial invoice, the packing list, has to be prepared for the FCL container, and then another commercial invoice and packing list for the LCL moves. They're not going to move under the same bill of lading, and they're not going to have the same customs clearance either. It's going to be two of each. We summarize that point in the last sentence here. Also, because there are essentially two shipments under this scenario, there will be some duplicate ocean charges. There will be 2 BL fees, as well as 2 customs entries upon arrival to the U.S. LCL for overflow can work. We as the importer just need to understand what the operational and financial ramifications are of employing LCL. A couple of more slides in this section. Another scenario where LCL can make sense is with vendors who produce on a build-to-order basis, a model that we've talked about incessantly through all of our modules. Depending on the urgency of an order, goods that come off of a vendor's production line can meet short-term demand by sending a smaller amount via LCL. Let's say a vendor has a very large purchase order from a U.S. importer, and there's a timing need for at least a portion of that order to keep sales moving, fill customer orders in the US, etc. Goods come off the production line, because they're in a build-to-order basis, they're good to go. Take a portion of that, 2, 3, 4, 5 cubic meters, however many units are needed, set up an LCL shipment, get it out the door, and then continue with the big production run. Which is to say, in our last bullet, with LCL shipments in the pipeline, vendors then focus on filling full containers. That is pretty common too, and an option to air freight depending on the urgency of the need for the goods. Last slide in this section. As importers increase the volume of purchases from international suppliers, they can grow into FCL shipments. This is especially true with new vendors in countries we as an importer haven't worked in before. We start with smaller orders, we move goods LCL, and then we graduate up to FCL shipments. If importers buy in smaller quantities from vendors that are in the same geographic region, we spoke of this a few slides back, they might consider using a buyer's consolidation model, which we're going to jump into very shortly. As a note, we make that statement, buyer's consol is studied in detail in the next section of this module. Buyer's consol is a big deal, as is transload, which we'll cover in the section after buyer's consol. So do come back as quickly as you can.